So I don't know who would like to go first. We have Vicky. Yes,
Um,
Vicky.
I think the I don't think that St James Cavalier is a big building. I think that St James Cavalier is a small building, and I think that it is a heterogeneous building in the sense that it offers different possibilities. It offers rooms where you can look at art exhibitions or installations. It offers a theatre, it offers a music room, it offers a rehearsal room, which can double up into a classroom or into all sorts of things. And it offers open spaces which can become anything one wants them to become. Um, However, I think that what is small, actually, in relation to the population, is the number of people who actually use and know about St. James Cavalier. And St. James Cavalier, this is saddening because St. James Cavalier is placed in a very strategic position in Valletta. It's not somewhere where you have to go specially to. You can really pop by. I have come to St. James Cavalier at all sorts of times of the day, even at the closure, and practically after it's opened, etc. And the one thing I think is, I think there's a lot of things which are going on, and I think some of them are really interesting, very, very dynamic. I thank God that this is the only cinema in Malta which does art and which is not commercially minded, where we do not see American films, where we see other things, and where we now even the fact of being linked to the Metropolitan or to the national is extremely good because it enlarges our vision of what theatre and opera should be. I think what is perhaps missing is something called cultural animation. And I think that cultural animation requires professional animators. And the fact of having children who practically come, I have watched school children in this building. Some are accompanied by teachers who are very dynamic and who really interact with what is being done, and some load them off, literally. And I think that the fact of not having this interface which can work with whatever is happening, whether it is a performance or whether it is an art exhibition, etc., and kind of not simply watch it, but interact with it through a figure who can make you, help you, whose profession is to help you interact with artistic realities, is a lack in a center which is creative. I also think that when we talk about education, I have big problems because we want to educate everybody. And unfortunately, I don't think that the word education is the right one in a center for creativity. I think the word appreciation and enjoyment and pleasure are just as important. And you have to also cultivate pleasure to teach people how to enjoy sometimes. If you are faced with some forms of art or some forms of theatre, it's an acquired taste. You have to learn how to handle them, how to tackle them, how to watch them, how to let them work in your mind. And that is, for me, the learning process, learning how to derive pleasure from things you do not know how to relate to. And I think that that is also being creative for an audience. And I know we're opening a can of worms, but I think that the question that really needs to be asked in St. James Cavalier is, how do we get our audience to be participatory? And how do we get our audience to be creative, at least in their minds and attitudes?
No, that is actually an excellent question, Vicky. It's one that you know, is very present, at least in my mind, and it's one I bring to our staff quite regularly. I mean, there are clearly various ways to approach something like that, and I am hoping that through not just our discussions, but also some of our plans now, our action plan in relation to the strategic vision, we will be addressing specifically this sort of thing. I do think that one of the things that we do need to do is work on this sort of question as well as other questions that relate to the big cans of worms in relation to multiple approaches. So it's not a one-size-fits-all sort of approach. So thank you very much for that. I think I saw someone else who wants to. Yes, right.
I'm not going to take too long because I think I've had my fair share of commentaries during the four sessions of ideas. But it's stimulating seeing, first of all, the ideas flowing about the building itself and about St. James Cavalier. And it's always coming out to the same issue, how we are going to get the audience. How are we going to attract? So I'd like to, and this is the decision why I've spoken this evening, I'd like to introduce a different concept than what has been discussed here tonight. Tony used the word outreach. I'm going to change it around. I'm going to say we have to reach out. It's about time that, okay, let's carry on organizing, building, and making use of the space that is St. James Cavalier. But the center of creativity has to move out there. Why? Because, for example, simply mentioning something that occurred last Saturday, something I've already discussed with Tony and possibly we'll try and do something about it. The audience is there, just down the road. Our audience is there in Republic Street at 6 o'clock in the evening. Kids who have nothing to do, nowhere to go, nobody wants them. There's a few hundreds of them down there every Saturday. They're using Valletta as a congregating place because they have absolutely nothing else to do. So what about us going out there? What about us? I'm involved in the radio, which is slowly Radio 2, National Radio, which is slowly now starting to build bridges with St. James Cavalier. So let's throw the radio out in the streets. Let's get the art and entertain them with what we are capable of doing. There's so much happening on this island right now. There's so much energy. Why do we have to keep on thinking of concentrating it solely in the building? We can move out. We can reach out with what energies are being created with this form of brain power. Because ultimately here, with the half dozen, 2 dozen people that there are, the element of IQ level that there is in this room is incredible. There's some very intelligent people around sitting in this room. So it's our duty, it's our responsibility. Which brings me to the closing statement that I believe, apart from being a curator for the arts, for the creativity, St. James Cavalier has to take on the role of being a social infuser of ideas. It must become something that changes our society to the better. Ultimately, that's the role. That's the responsibility of using public funds. That's the responsibility of the national broadcaster. That's the responsibility of the Creativity Center of St. James Cavalier. That we must be the seeding ground for change, for a better future for us all. We talk about education, and as soon as the word education pops up, all of a sudden we say school visits. What about these kids down the road who don't give a damn about schools? How are we going to reach them? And it's with this idea in mind that I'm joining in and I'm putting in my energies. That yes, St. James Cavalier is something that has created a lot in these last 15 years. But I believe that it's time that St. James Cavalier evolves, moves into something else, becomes a seeding ground for change, literally.
But this is very useful, Ray, because it also brings to my mind, at least, something that I'm quite keen in pushing forward. And there's a cultural shift that has happened internationally as well as nationally over the last number of years. And this is that we as societies are no longer simply consumers of the products of creativity, but we are also all producers. Each and every one of us is a producer in the creative industries, to some degree or other. Many of us take photos, many of which are seen by more people than some of the photos that sometimes hang even in this building. These photos are shared on things like Facebook and so on and so forth. This may not apply to everyone in this room, of course, but it will certainly apply to many of the teenagers that Ray, for example, just referred to, about whom we are in conversations, for example, with the Valletta Local Council in terms of looking at ways of facilitating or making available space around the area in relation to some of this work. And so these are ideas that we are very wide open to receiving as proposals. And this is why we have a rolling call for proposals for the things that may happen. I see my old colleague, Faile Tazzopardi here, for example, who works at the National Library. And so we are looking at ways, for example, to see how we can collaborate, perhaps, with the National Library, so that we no longer think of the National Library as simply a place for education, but also for entertainment, perhaps, and enjoyment, as Vicky so beautifully put it. Which takes me back to, if you will allow me, the formal terminology, informal learning, really, and informal education. If we want to stay away from the education, I guess it's formal learning, but learning with a very small L, where the emphasis is on enjoying the process and exploring and discovering new things. Please.
Okay.
Yes. Shall we, or did you want to, sorry, Milena, did you want to react to Ray?
If you allow me, yes, I just wanted to make a quick comment to extend a little bit the audience issue. It's true that many institutions are seen as buildings. Actually, when we speak about the branding, the building, the environment is a very big part of it. When we speak about the audiences, obviously we also need to see how we present ourselves in the digital environment. This is very true about all memory institutions, and the National Library was mentioned here, but it's also part of what I believe the Centre will have to come with in the future. And the branding in the digital space is also very important.
Indeed. I think this is a point I had planned to come back to myself anyway, so thank you for bringing it up, Milena. Please.
Yeah, I want to throw in another word that I think links up all of these points that have been made, and I gather that you are Ray Bondine and you are, I don't know your name.
Vicky.
This is Vicky Cremona from
Vicky
the University of
Cremona,
Malta's Theatre Studies.
And perhaps I should know this, but I didn't.
That's all right.
So the word that I wanted to throw in is engagement. The notion that we don't just come here as audience or as even performers or whatever. We come here as engaged citizens. And that's, I think, what is really important for me about the possibilities within St. James Cavalier. My name is Josephine Burden, and I'm a writer, and I live in Valletta. And I've been here for 6 years, maybe. And I just want to say that Rubber Bodies were actually one of the first exciting organisations or performance groups that I came across at the Maritime Museum. It was actually when you were doing that then. I want to make 2 points about engagement. The first is how we engage on an organisational level with organisation to organisation. the National Library to St. James Cavalier, the radio to St. James Cavalier, and so on. I'm actually also a founder member of an organisation called the Malta Australia Community Arts Foundation, which is in its very formative years, and it won't really get going until I'm dead, because it's about an artist exchange program using my flat as a residence place. But I would really want to come and talk easily with St. James Cavalier about the creative process of developing that kind of program. How would I go about doing that? Who can I talk to? What networks can I make use of? So that's one level of engagement, organisation to organisation. The other level of engagement, and it's probably one that's dearer to my heart, and you started it with the notion of outreach to young people and how we can engage with young people and how we can enable young people to engage here with us. One of the occasions when I felt most involved with St. James Cavalier was with Ziguzag, where I volunteered, and that was a great creative process, because I would come here each day and there would be a buzz. There would be people dashing here or solving this problem there, or no, it was exciting, and we started here in St. James Cavalier, but then all of the activities were somewhat going on in here, but a lot of them were going on all around Valletta. So the streets were abuzz as well with those things going on, and I and presumably the other people who were involved in it felt profoundly engaged with St. James Cavalier. We felt this was a really great thing that was going on here. So I suppose that's two ways, practical ways, in which I can see this kind of engagement, possibilities of engagement as far as St. James goes on. And of course, once you start opening in that way, then engagement generates further engagement and other possibilities and other ways that this. So it's not that you find your identity and that's it, full stop, we're there. This is our identity. It's that we open door possibilities that allow more and more engagement and going further out.
Thank you, Josephine. Did we have a comment? Yes, Rafael.
Hi. Hi. One question. Have you tried doing this session with children, with kids? What is the... Because the average age here, sorry, it's 40 or 30, 40.
It's okay. Thank you for being here.
Okay.
That's a fabulous idea. You know, I think we should certainly consider doing this. It is part of what we're in the process of doing is reevaluating, you know, how we manage to communicate with audiences by listening to our audiences and our potential audiences, our existing audiences and our potential new audiences. So I think that is a fabulous idea. So thank you. Yes. Yeah, we need the microphone, Ray, if you're going to say. Do we have? Yes, Martina, please.
Well, my academic background places me at the nexus of political science and sociology, with a particular interest in identity, actually. But I've also, throughout the years, really cultivated an interest in and an appreciation for and an engagement with, let's say, put all those words in there, the arts and culture. I think the three sort of points in your strategic vision, so we have identity, diversity, and legacy, are actually very much overlapping. But as someone sort of with an interest in identity, academically, of course, you may all disagree with me, but that's your prerogative. I feel that the questions you pose are very much asking us what we think about St. James, and what I would have liked to see more of was perhaps some kind of narrative coming from the strategic vision, which I felt was quite lacking, honestly.
Yes.
Obviously, this is developed, and this is to be developed, but I'm quite glad that even the discussion, and it seems even in previous sessions, the idea of audiences came out, because I also thought that was quite lacking. In a sense that we need, I say we, I don't know really who I'm talking about, but St. James needs to engage and cultivate this enjoyment and this outreach with audiences, because I think a legacy is not only about archiving, it's also about the presentation of what is being presented here. I mean, it has to be tangible, whether it is intangible or not. I don't literally mean whether we can touch it or not. It's just as in we have to put this out there. And I think that should be part of St. James's narrative.
Yes, indeed. No, I think your point is very well taken. Perhaps I should have emphasized a little bit that this was the strategic vision that I presented when I was first appointed. In the last 6 months, as you would expect, we've done quite a bit of work, both on refining the strategic vision, as well as on beginning to develop an action plan that relates to having a strategic plan. So the next phase, of all this is to take in as much of all these wonderful recommendations and these great ideas that are being shared in this series of events, and come up with a strategic plan. A strategic plan is something that may sound grand and grandiose, but it's not. That is to say, I've asked myself, if you will, all these questions. Now, how do we go about answering these questions? And when will we be satisfied with the kind of answers that we're beginning to procure for these questions? That is how a strategic plan works. So you would say, well, you're saying audiences. Okay, so what do you really want to do with audiences? What are your targets? What are your goals in relation to this? And how are you going to go about them? And without being too pedantic, we're looking at things like measuring things. Now, measuring isn't necessarily the way doing it, the way bean counters do it, because clearly here we're not in the business of making a profit. We don't charge money, for example, here so that we make money, which is to say to make a profit, but whatever money is charged here is to enable us to facilitate even more of the sort of work that we do. And so that's just one example. So yes, indeed, at the end of today's session, I was also planning to announce what we'll be doing in the next session, which is specifically to go to the at bit of IDEAT. IDEAT is also an acronym in Maltese for this idea of identity, diversity, and legacy. In Maltese, I've chosen to translate, or to use the words rather, identità, diversità, eredità, and the at is actività, so activity. So what activities are we planning? So the next session will be indeed in relation to this, but I don't want to jump the gun too much. I'll come back to that. But yes, thank you for holding my feet to the fire, Martina. Yes, I think Georgina has a comment as well.
I'd like to comment on two things. Your presentation with regards to, well, I'll put it in inverted commas, education, leaves out early education. St. James has a narrative for that. I mean, you cannot change perceptions, absolutely, if you leave that stage of the life cycle out.
Indeed.
My other question relates to how your outreach plans for exceptionality. I mean, ultimately, St. James has is a player on the circuit, and it has to provide a platform for exceptionality too. I'm obviously, inclusion is what this should be about too. However, I'd like to see the other end of the spectrum. How are we going to provide that leap?
Absolutely.
The leap in quality, the leap in professionalization, the leap in recognizing exceptionality. And I think no artistic process, can be stimulated in any way if everything is as it is. If we do not take the time as an institution to, as we should, I firmly believe, to recognize exceptionality and to help that germinate. Because ultimately what we want to do is not simply in terms of measurement here, but in terms of helping the sector itself develop. I feel St. James should play a role here. I'm not going to go into the arguments of creative industries, etc. But the idea that our artists, our creatives, needs to be acknowledged, and how St. James's vision is going to address this, or perhaps challenge the stereotype, or challenge the status quo at this point, where sometimes we tend to, to assume that everyone is the same. The idea where we tend to sideline exceptionality for the sake of,
Indeed. I mean, the term I use, or rather the phrase I used, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Georgina, or I'm misinterpreting what you're saying here. I said it's the idea of balancing quality with inclusion. So it's not a matter of, let's say when we say balancing, it's not a matter of making sure we're as inclusive as possible at the same time as providing quality, because in some ways this can be impossible. But exceptionality, by its very definition, is exclusive in some ways. But the quality, I think, can come from all sorts of directions. But the point of exceptionality, I mean, clearly, is in the kind of work, I would say then, that we not perhaps simply make sure we provide space for, but work that we encourage in relation to development by even commissioning as an organization. And in that is where we most definitely need to be even more specific and deliberate in our choices, because again, if we're speaking about public funds, we're talking about very limited public funds here, and even more limited in relation to being able to do this sort of thing. So we want to make sure that we're spending the taxpayers' euros on the best quality, exceptional work that we can present within this environment.
If I may, Tone. So how will we set ourselves apart from other institutions, other cultural institutions, who may be perhaps more likely to, I mean, on the same circuit as us, but perhaps not at,
Well,
how will we differentiate ourselves from this?
I think this, from my perspective at least, is a process in the sense that, well, we have various ways we can do this, and we have some of these various ways that we are beginning to do or we're already doing. One example of that is this open call for proposals that we have, which isn't simply a matter of receiving applications for people who want to present their work within the space, but we have a number of criteria that we've also published, which incidentally are also available on our website for anyone who wants to submit a proposal. And this comes to a point system, which we then, through a team of people assessing each application, we give marks to, essentially. And so we are grading these applications, and clearly work that is not exceptional is much less likely, because of the way the selection criteria are weighted, to receive a mark that would make it seem like it's exceptional when it's not exceptional. As I say, there is some subjectivity to some of this, of course, but not too much, I would say. And I see Maria smiling here, because we've had long conversations about this idea of there isn't too much subjectivity. Milena, did you want to say something?
Well, since we started adding different words, and it's easy when somebody else has to develop the strategic vision, I think that the word innovation also should come to the map, and what sort of cultural innovation is being fostered in the center.
Yes, I think this would be one of the keywords that relates to the idea of diversity, because one of the ways that I've explained this idea of diversity is more in terms of difference. Now again, without being too theoretical, in saying this is the post-structural sense of difference, this indeed would relate to innovation, but also I think, coupling this with exceptionality, as Georgina put it, is essential because in relation to innovation, we know that yes, it's experimental is the term that Ira used earlier to describe, her own performance collective. But not every experiment is a success. Many experiments are failures, as we know. But in the arts particularly, unlike in the sciences, all experiments are great. And I have a problem with that personally, to be quite honest. So for me, innovation isn't always of the quality or standard, or as exceptional as it should be in relation to receiving the sustained support that it would or it could from a national institution. I mean, at least this is my position.
Just one little thing. Well, if we bring in innovation, the concept itself is tied up with the idea of action.
Yeah.
Right? So I think innovation itself brings to mind action, which is something quite removed from creativity itself. Creativity is about origination, but innovation itself is demanding action.
No, that's a good point. No, you can take the
Tony, can
microphone.
I just interject?
Yes,
a
please.
little? It picks up on a little bit on what Ray was saying about, well, I want to use the word relevance to add another word to it. I mean, it is important that there's a quality threshold and you have your applications and they're vetted and it's seen to promote exception. And then we've got the inclusion thing, and we want to bring school kids in, we want to try and, I hate to use educate, but elucidate them to alternative forms of culture and creativity that they might not come across within the national curriculum or a very structured curriculum, and they wouldn't be exposed to the things that Robert Bodies is doing. There's also relevance. I mean, and it's the point you made about the people out there are actually creators themselves these days, and actually do they care what St. James is doing? I mean, honestly, my son is there doing masses of creative stuff online, talking to all sorts of people. Half the time I don't know what he's doing, it's true. But there's a lot of creativity going on then, and he goes, oh, I've got to go to it. That's why I said he wasn't wowed when he came. There are so many school kids came in 2004, and X number of performances were seen and visited and whatever, and so many more attended Ziguzai last year than the year before. At a certain age, when they do get beyond the early years, and I think the early years have been quite well catered for, it's those later years when they're there with their mobile devices, they're hanging around in the streets, be it Ormy or wherever, or Valletta, and they're probably creating while they're doing that. They're probably sharing stuff, and God knows what's going on. So for them, St. James, why do I need to go there? It's not relevant. So you've got this really, between the rock and the hard place, and I appreciate this, a lot of people of my son's age, and these people Ray mentioned, just don't care. And they don't care about your thresholds because they have so much at school which says testing, testing, testing. Have you got this mark? You've got to pull up that mark. You've got to get through your maths. It's all education means to them is that. So in their downtime, the last thing they really want to do, and I beg to differ a little bit with Vicky, is to go to necessarily at a certain age, and I'm talking probably 10 onwards these years, to do something that's animated, however professionally animated, because it's yawn. It doesn't beam into how they're experiencing culture. So you are now taking over St. James at a time when more than ever, the last decade, we've seen people interacting with culture and creativity beyond the bounds of any institution or building, or it's a very difficult time. And yet I agree totally with Ira that we need still a bit of the education to show people different forms of creativity that they're not going to get, even if they're doing whatever they're doing on their mobile devices with their mates peer-to-peer or within the curriculum. So there is that role to do. And I don't know how you're going to massage those two, but I think relevance is a really key thing because St. James, whatever's up there, can still be hugely irrelevant to a lot of people.
I think an immediate way to start addressing that, which is what we're really trying to do, we're quite a way away yet, but we'll get there, I'm sure of it, is for the left hand to start knowing what the right hand is doing. So I'll give you an example. Right here we have an exceptional visual artist. This is Pier Portelli. Sorry to put you on the spot, Pier. His work, Repubblica, which many of you may have seen, this very large megaphone-looking structure, was placed on the entrance to what used to be the Royal Opera House. This was a wonderful piece of public art that some of you may have even interacted with. it's an interactive piece through which you could have spoken and be heard by people coming in through Citygate into the city, really. I saw literally dozens of these kids that break speaking interacting with this piece. Many of whom took pictures of themselves doing all sorts of things that I'm not sure Pierre has captured in his documentation of this work, but you have heard, yeah. And so now, is this devaluing the art? Is this adding value to the art? Is this the kind of interaction we want? Is this the kind of entertainment or enjoyment we want of our exceptional works of art that are being presented in public spaces or semi-public spaces, really? Because this is, well, where it is was once certainly not so much of a public space, but now with the way the Royal Opera House has been rearranged, it has become a public space. And what kind of I don't know what the word is really. What is it that they're taking away with them from this interaction? Is it an anecdote that perhaps in 50 years' time, when people are saying, oh, it's this anniversary of the Republic, oh, I remember when I interacted with this piece of public art, and here's a picture of me from back then. Oh, hang on a minute. No one ever showed us how to archive our photos of our mobile devices, and so, no, we don't really have any of those pictures. I do have an old picture of another family member from when the Republic happened in 1974, because back then they used to put photos on these bits of things called paper. You know, I mean, so again, just there, one little narrative example of how complex, very easily, but very simply at the same time, you know, this sort of interaction can really
but that could be considered momentary engagement, and they actually don't care about a legacy from it.
But not if they're coming. If they're coming back week after week. So this was there for several weeks, and I don't know, because I didn't really have the time to watch this closely. But I have a hunch, let's say, and a fairly strong hunch, that some of the same kids came back, you know, the following week or a couple of weeks later. Oh, hang on a minute, now I'm going to do this with. So, you know, yes, the one-off perhaps, you could say, you know, that engagement over a couple of weeks. But what of the next piece that's there? Well, the piece that's there now perhaps doesn't attract the kind of work that way. And so should it have been programmed in the same space or not? That's not a question I'm necessarily interested in answering. Really, it's a rhetoric question. But yes, I guess, you know, the question needs to be asked, but not just to be asked, I suppose is the point I'm making, but to be engaged with.